Financial Modeling, Topic 14, Futures Contracts, Section 4, Managing Basis Risk of a Cross-Hedge. Going off the last example in Section 3, what if in this situation, Hershey wants a higher quality cocoa that happens to be made in Ghana? However, you know that the futures contract is going to result in the cheapest to deliver asset, which we said was Ivory Coast cocoa. Say the current difference between Ivory Coast cocoa and Ghana cocoa prices in the spot market is $200. We'll call that the Ghana Ivory Coast basis, right? That $200 for the extra quality of that Ghana cocoa. Now Hershey could still use that same Ivory Coast futures contract to protect against the overall increase in cocoa prices as long as the basis between Ghana and Ivory Coast remained the same throughout the life of the contract. So we're just looking at an example here. Say on January 1st, 2019, Hershey goes long 100 contracts, each contract for 10 tons of cocoa at a futures price of $25.50 when the spot price of Ivory Coast cocoa is $2,500. And then prior to maturity, they're going to unwind that futures contract by going short, and we'll say the futures price jumped up to $3,500. The futures and the spot price of Ivory Coast cocoa have jumped up to $3,500. So this is a bad situation if they are not hedging, because they would pay $3,500, that new spot price of Ghana cocoa in this case. So let's remember, in this case, they're going to buy Ghana cocoa. This is the asset they want. The futures contract is for Ivory Coast. So if the price of Ivory Coast cocoa jumps up to $3,500 and the basis between Ghana and Ivory Coast remains $200, that means Ghana cocoa is selling for $3,700. So they're going to spend $3,700 a ton, and again they want 1,000 tons. So they'd pay $3.7 million if they did not hedge using this contract. Now their expected hedge cost, once they put on this futures contract and make that decision to unwind, the expected hedge cost when they put on that contract is that futures price plus that initial basis times those 1,000 tons. So once they put on the hedge, they effectively locked into $25.50 to buy the Ivory Coast cocoa, which they're not actually going to buy. They're going to just profit from the price change, and then pay up the extra $200 to buy the Ghana cocoa. So let's look at that in the actual two trades or two transactions they're going to make. So in December 15th, they are going to buy their Ghana cocoa for $3,700, that high price. However, they're going to make a profit on the difference between where they want long and short on those two futures contracts times the 10 contracts. The multiplier of 10 times 100 contracts. So they're going to get a check for $950,000 due to the increase in Ivory Coast cocoa. They're then going to buy their Ghana cocoa, and when I add those two numbers together, you'll see they have locked in to that price as long as the basis doesn't change. Now, what if the basis does change? What if Ghana cocoa goes to $4,000? In other words, at maturity, Ivory Coast is selling for $3,500, which then determines the actual payoff of the futures contract, and Ghana cocoa is selling for $4,000. Now it's a $500 basis. In that case, they are no longer fully hedged. Notice they're paying an extra $300 or $300,000 because of that basis widening. So even though they're not paying that full $4 million, that contract is not paying them due to the differences between Ghana and Ivory Coast cocoa. So this is their situation now. They're hedged against overall price increases of cocoa, assuming Ivory Coast and Ghana are perfectly correlated and move together. Their remaining risk is the basis, the fact that Ghana and Ivory Coast cocoa are not moving one for one. So let's talk a little bit about this. Hershey's cross hedge of Ghana cocoa using the Ivory Coast cocoa futures contract will hedge against overall increases in cocoa levels as long as the basis doesn't change. But in this case, Hershey is still exposed to a widening of the basis at maturity. Now, interestingly, you actually can buy another contract that are called Ghana Ivory Coast basis swaps. These are contracts that pay you for a widening in that basis. So another innovation in financial markets. So in this topic, we talked about managing the basis risks of a cross hedge.